Hi, and welcome back to this last section of the lecture. You'll recall from the previous section that we were talking about the way in which scientific developments in the 18th century led to the conception of different forms of strict racial identity based upon differential immunity to these epidemic diseases that were gripping European empires, and the ways that those helped to solidify conceptions of race. And in this section, we're going to turn to think about the ways that that is expanded upon in the early 19th century with different forms of empire after the revolutions of the late 18th century, and the way in which that then breeds a framework for tropical medicine, in which Europeans then begin to have a new sense of faith in their ability to govern and oversee empires that are no longer made up of Europeans, but which are made up of non-European peoples. And ways that frame the justification for that differently into the late 19th century that have ramifications for the imperial and post-colonial moment in the 20th century. So, to start off with then, we've been already thinking about the way that Europeans fled from the Caribbean as they came to the conclusion that it was an environment much more suited to Africans and African hard labor, and European planters often would become absentees. That effect and that vision of empire is expanded and doubled down in the late 18th and early 19th century for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the American revolutions that happened, the Anglo-American Revolution that separates off the settler colonial empire and leaves Britain with its Caribbean empire primarily and leads it to shift towards India. The Haitian Revolution that sort of shows to the French that the Caribbean is an ungovernable space, or a dangerous and ungovernable space. And the Spanish-American revolutions that break off much of Spanish America from Spanish control. And so in these ways, empire becomes something very distinctly exotic. And that's increased in the early 19th century for a number of other reasons. The abolition movement in England, for example, really pushes and doubles down on the visions that we were thinking about earlier of the Caribbean as being as a morally dangerous place, as an unproductive place, dominated by this corrupt form of slave labor and by essentially kind of creolized white people who are too lazy to work for themselves. And so all of this negative views of the plantation complex in the Caribbean, and eventually the abolition of slavery in the 1830s really pushes this idea that the Caribbean is an exotic other in which Europeans shouldn't be acting and can't act as effectively, and are reliant upon slave labor and all of these negative connotations. They're also, in their turn towards India, coming to racialize and understand South Asians as distinct in relation to disease. And they're doing this, as British control is expanding in India in the early 19th century, they're coming to think about and to conceptualize why it is that they're able to exert this growing level of control over this huge population of South Asians. And they do so by increasingly racializing South Asians as weak. And the way that they understand that is that weakness is inherently tied to South Asian race as a product of living endemically, particularly with diseases, particularly with malaria, over generations, right? So South Asians are weak, and that is why British people can govern them in this theory of empire, and that weakness is a product of endemic disease that's true of South Asia. And so this becomes a dangerous, exotic place with its own diseases that weaken the population. And all of this then leads to a turn away from a settler vision of empire towards an exploitation vision of empire, in which Europeans go in small numbers to exploit populations. So they continue to exploit populations along the African coasts, particularly in India. So there's this turn away from settler empire then. And lots of these things come to a head, this idea, this growing division between the empire and the center and the metropolis, between Europe and its empires. And in the middle of the 19th century. And we can see this through thinking about the case study of cholera. So we're going to dig into cholera for a minute. Cholera provides the growth of the cholera virus and epidemic in the cholera bacteria in this period really drives home these divisions, because it originates in India. So it originates, the earliest incidences of these main waves of cholera in the 19th century begin in India in the sort of second decade of the 19th century. And they are immediately tied up with this sense of oriental danger and oriental responses to illness, because British officials who see cholera on the ground in the very beginning of the 19th century in India see Indian responses to it, in which they try to treat it using spiritual, traditional Indian medicine and traditional Indian ideas about disease. And so we get, in these first cholera epidemics, the development of ideas that cholera is tied to a particular previously undiscovered god. Many women are dressed up as this goddess who parade in the streets. They have these large ceremonies in which people are trying to kind of propitiate this god who is angry as a result of the cholera epidemic. So Europeans in India, British people in India, perceiving all of this, are seeing cholera as tied up with exotic superstition, seeing it also tied up with this practice of ritual cleaning in the Ganges, which is, of course, because cholera is waterborne, actually circulating the disease and helping to circulate it and spread it as people take water from the Ganges to other parts of India. But this idea of ritual bathing in the Ganges also seems to tie the cholera, the growing danger of the cholera disease, with conceptions of oriental danger in South Asia. And that danger is even more problematic to Europeans as it begins to spread out from these places and begins to threaten the metropolis, begins to threaten Europe. So Europeans increasingly see this as a disease born of South Asia that seems to threaten to bring everything that is dangerous and versionary about empire and about Eastern Asiatic empire to Europe. And so cholera begins to become sort of racialized as Asiatic cholera. And we've seen the effect in our own moment that, tying disease to nationality has for the political project of particular individuals. And here we see this in a very similar way, that cholera becomes known as Asiatic cholera and envisioned in that way. In the Paris cholera epidemic of 1832, once cholera makes it to Europe in the 1830s in Paris, Paris and France is portrayed in all of these pictures as, in popular culture at this moment, as the kind of inverse of India, and that this is a dangerous inversion coming from the East to overturn French society. Right? So Paris is seen as the opposite of India, and the danger of India being brought to Paris. You see this in the British case too, where you see this cartoon on the left here of John Bull, who is the symbol of English identity here, warding off, and incidentally, interestingly, using a wall, right, the wall of Old England, the wooden wall of Old England, against this figure representing cholera. Cholera is generally portrayed as blue because that's one of the symptoms of the later stages of cholera infection, but a blue skin tone. But you can see from the dress here that this is clearly orientalized, and that John Bull is warding off this danger of cholera from crossing into England. So all of this is about dividing England from and Europe from its empires. And you can see then, again, in a few other images, the way that this works. You can see the map in the background here depicts the routes, and this is one of these early sort of invocations of a mapping a disease, right? You see the transmission routes of cholera as it spreads out from India and reaches into Europe, and then eventually on the other side of the map that's partially covered crosses the Atlantic and arrives in the Americas as well. And the idea that cholera can be mapped using new forms of Western superior medical knowledge, and create visual depictions that look very similar to our own sort of Johns Hopkins 2020 coronavirus maps, right? But here we have these early iterations of this tracing the spread of cholera and routing it all in India in these lines that emanate out, that follow the trade routes out of India. And the way, again, you can see in the American case here, a depiction of cholera as Oriental cholera personified as another South Asian character. You can see cholera written on its belt, but he's depicted as Asian, and he's depicted as an immigrant that is coming over incidentally on a British ship. So this shows that in America the connection of Britain and its empire to the spreading of Asian influence around the world is all critical, and seeing this as being the dangerous effects of cholera. So the cholera epidemic, though, it brings this idea of exotic empire and its dangers to Europe, but it also reinforces the need for European empires to build strong state apparatus to combat this, right, to control the dangerous parts of their empires, right, and to facilitate the expansion of the bureaucratization of empire to minimize the effects of the danger of cholera. You see very quickly in the middle of the 19th century the emergence of more rigid systems of quarantining ships, and that's partly what you see in this cartoon here. The wooden wall of old England, right, is this idea that England can have this natural barrier. It can quarantine using the navy. It can quarantine ships and prevent the importation of cholera. So there's a lot of use of quarantines and of international cooperation in Europe to try to impose authority, not simply on its own empires, but on other regions. So in 1851, the French gather an international sanitary conference for the first time to talk about the dangers of the spread of cholera. And they use that by bringing in representatives of the Ottoman Empire and some Eastern Mediterranean powers as an excuse to exert European authority over the Ottoman Empire for the first time. So this is an example of where cholera becomes this way in which European empires kind of expand their informal as well as their formal power, right, over places that are not formally part of their empire. And in places which are formally part of their empire, you see much greater bureaucratization of state medicine, right? You see the establishment of the Indian Medical Service, which I mentioned in the previous short lecture section, about the way in which a British medical service is designed to help imperial officials and colonial soldiers to weather the storm in South Asia, and also to enforce, and also the use of those imperial bureaucracy to enforce what they see as hygienic measures, European visions of hygiene that will help to alleviate the problems. And this is going to ramp up in the 1890s, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you already begin to see this idea that Europeans have a better sense of hygiene, especially once they figure out, and so they figure out what the vectors for cholera are. They figure out that it's waterborne, that it's about hygiene. And once they figure that out in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, they can then employ that in places like India as an excuse to clear slums, to prevent, which are growing because cities are in British India are expanding rapidly. You can basically kind of impose urban planning, and you can control urban populations based upon this theory of understanding what's causing this disease. So it gives them an excuse to exercise much greater state power, both on an international level with these things like sanitary conferences, and then on a local colonial level as well, through the importation of bureaucratic state control over people's lives in these quote-unquote exotic areas. What it also does is increasingly sorts empire, right? So there's beginning to be this sense that Europeans are looking for a bifurcated empire. They've been thinking in the early 19th century about the empire as in slightly distinct ways, but the effects, particularly of the cholera epidemics, followed by the 1857 Indian attacks on British and counterattacks on British imperialism, they are seeing pushback in exotic locations and a real turn towards looking for other parts of the empire that look much more hospitable and safe. And so you start to see this distinction and growing distinction within the British Empire between South Asia and particularly Australasia, and to some extent South Africa, but largely Australasia, as being a safe space, a much more European space, a place that's suitable to English settlement and habitation, in contrast to South Asia. And so they see themselves as fighting not only people in South Asia, but also the disease environment. And they don't have to struggle with those things in Australia and New Zealand. And so in the 1850s in particular, you begin to see this real flip around of division of empire. And Australasia, and particularly local colonial governments in Australasia, trying to push this idea that they are a different kind of empire, a safer kind of empire. The officials in New Zealand, for example, talk about the sickly nabobs of India being eager to reach New Zealand, and mass emigration of British officials who are unhappy with the disease environment and with the potential after the 1857 attacks, are all fleeing to New Zealand. And you do see this migration of people out of British India to these quote-unquote safer places. And the army is also looking, the British Army and Navy are looking to develop convalescent hospitals and facilities particularly in Australasia, and you actually have this competition in the 1850s between Auckland, New Zealand, and Hobart in Tasmania over where the major convalescent station for the British Army's Indian operations is going to be. This idea that they represent different and safer climates, different in disease environments that will help to refresh soldiers so they can more quickly get back to India to carry on fighting and carry on defending the British Empire, but that they represent this safe space. And you can see that depicted then in this 1858 map of disease in the disease in the world, as in health and disease and the natural phenomenon. You can see it's very difficult to make out because the quality of this map's not great, and I apologize for that. But across all of these different areas are words depicting the diseases that were prevalent in those places. But you can see from the colors, right, that the southern part of Australia and New Zealand and South Africa are colored in ways that depict them as having a similar climate to Europe, right? A similar acceptable climate, this sort of European zone. And if you could zoom in, what you would see here written in Australia is the words that say, like, because all of these are different diseases that are prevalent. And in Australia, it doesn't say anything apart from only diseases that are, nothing except the diseases that are found in England, except for cholera, being that not only as Australia doesn't have diseases that are found anywhere else in the tropical world, but they also don't even have cholera either, right? So they're even safer than Britain. They're even safer than Europe. So this depiction of these places as the ideal settler societies in contrast to the tropical empire and the sorting of empire that's going on here. But there is another part of this story, right? Because once you get to the very last couple of decades of the 19th century, things begin to change for the tropical side of this empire too. Because of innovations that occur within scientific practice. In the 1880s, there is a revolution, and historians of science will debate about the nature, the degree to which this is a revolution, the speed at which it happens, the roots of it. But essentially, there is a revolution in the understanding of disease because of the work of Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur in bacteriology and parasitology, understanding what causes diseases and using microscopes to understand what causes diseases. There's a revolution in the conception of how you diagnose disease and how you treat diseases. And that has big implications for imperial officials who become really interested in it very quickly. The man in the top, the image in the top center of your slide here is Patrick Manson, who's a Scottish guy who's an imperial official in Hong Kong in the late 19th century, who is really interested in the work of Pasteur and Koch and their connections in Britain, and begins using microscopes to study diseases in Hong Kong and sending information back to England. And when he returns to England, in the very end of the 19th century, he's going to be instrumental in establishing a school for what he calls tropical medicine. The idea that the tropics have different sorts of bacteria and viruses, and that it is Europeans' responsibility to figure out what's behind those, to treat them separately. He goes on to help to found the Royal Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and the School of Tropical Medicine in London, which trains people in a distinct field of tropical medicine. And when you think about this, right, there's nothing inherently different about diseases in tropical locations. The idea of a tropical medicine the idea that of there being a field of medicine called tropical medicine is inherently framed by colonialism and Orientalism. This idea that the tropical environment has a distinct sort of problematic environment that Europeans need to wrestle with distinctly from the viruses and diseases that they encounter at home, the exotic, right? And so this is all critical to framing this, to continuing to frame this place as different, but to frame Europeans as now being able to master it in a way that they weren't before, right? To being able to have this superior knowledge that they can employ, that this isn't just an exotic place that needs to be quarantined, but which is a place that Europeans can understand as a separate sphere and treat. And as part of this, you've got the innovations that other imperial officials at this time make, particularly Ronald Ross, who goes on to win the Nobel Prize for his work in India, identifying the bacteria behind that transfer through mosquitoes in the malarial infection. So he figures out that. He figures out the bacteria that are behind malaria and the way in which they're transmitted through mosquitoes. That wins him the Nobel Prize, but it also helps him to conceptualize India as this place that is kind of, he's basically unlocking the puzzle of what's holding India back, right? He in his own comments about why he's interested in this work, sees malaria as being this curse that makes India and other places in the tropics, quote, unsuitable for the full development of civilization. And that by unlocking this key, this is what's distinct from what Ross says from what has gone before, is that in unlocking this key, he is going to be able to make these places now suitable for civilization. If Europeans can eliminate malaria, then they can bring these areas up. They can develop these places and make them more fully part of the empire. They can break this sorting of empire into dangerous, unsuitable areas and suitable areas, and really kind of bring a paternalistic improvement to the whole of empire. And so this is a new framework for kind of potentially reforming the tropics in new ways and rationalizing empire in new ways in the later part of the 19th century. That this isn't just about kind of exploiting these areas and tapping them for some resources because they are less developed and they never will be more developed. But now it's about having a paternalistic care and actually helping in developing these regions using Western superiority. And that goes into action then with the development of medical infrastructure of empire in the very end of the 19th century. In the French case, they're kind of well ahead of this in terms of bureaucratization because Pasteur develops the Pasteur Institute in Paris and its many, many laboratories around the different French possessions. So as France expands out across Africa, for example, and builds these different colonial societies, they establish Pasteur Institutes that feed back data and information into the center. In Europe, in England, they also see this through the development of medical missionary societies. And so Manson's School of Tropical Medicine becomes a key place for training missionaries in tropical medicine in order to provide them with a skill that they go out and establish, right? And so you see, for example, on the right-hand side here, the homes for lepers. So leprosy mission, the development of a Christian evangelical approach to the New World that combines a developmental kind of focus on healing endemic diseases, and particularly the leprosy mission, in establishing these leprosy homes, in trying to solve the problems of leprosy. So missionaries then provide another infrastructure of medical empire that gain new justification, basically, on the basis of European ability to figure out medical problems and to solve the quote-unquote medical problems of their tropical empires. And all of this then facilitates a massive paternalistic effort at development, and the idea that these areas need to be developed and need to be brought up to a more civilized level. And we see some of the tensions here inherent in this, in some of the effects that this has on the first major epidemic to hit in the aftermath of the development of these theories. In 1896, a new outbreak of bubonic plague, which seems to have begun possibly in Hong Kong, somewhere along the coast of China, arrives in India and begins to have massive effect in India. It ends up in the next 20 years actually spreading across India and killing approximately 10 to 12 million people, which is as many people as the flu pandemic will go on to kill in 1918 in India. So this actually has this huge effect. And it is petrifying to Europeans because not only is this another potential disease that could make its way back to Europe, but it's a disease that has really evocative memory for Europeans in terms of being the Black Death, right? The idea that this is the plague of medieval Europe that was so terrifying. And so they are terrified about the arrival of plague, and so the empire uses all of this new infrastructure to immediately crack down. You can see here in the top image a depiction of actually a colorized photograph of early efforts to establish medical bureaucracy across India and vaccinate people against plague, and use the bureaucratic state to combat this, right? And they also use this as an excuse, like I was talking about with cholera, but they really amp this up to kind of clear illegal property, to seize property and to destroy it, to embargo trade from particular cities for different moments to try to shut down plague, to examine people as they travel from one part of India to another on trains, to examine them for signs of plague, to use this to get into people's lives. And it also improves information networks within the empire. There's a rapid increase in the use of telegraphy, which had just been developed, to connect different parts of India back to the imperial officials and to keep them updated on the effects of plague. So all of this this idea that plague is a new existential danger, but also one that empire feels like it's now capable of really addressing and quashing, which you can use its power to do so, really pushes the British Empire in India in new ways. But that, of course, in some respects helps to lead a pushback from Indian populations. You get actually large numbers of riots and panics about the imperial measures themselves, more than the disease. You get real pushback in India, and you get pushback particularly amongst the nascent nationalist group and anti-colonial groups in India in the early 20th century against this imposition, which is all framed around medicine and epidemic disease. And so nationalists actually, to some extent, partially go back to embracing traditional Indian forms of medicine and traditional Indian forms of healing as a pushback against this use of Western medicine to impose new levels of imperialism upon them in this period. So empire then has completely changed in many respects by the time you get to this point. In its relationship to disease, the way that it thinks it can engage with disease and combat it, and use a rhetoric and a theory of science and Western superiority to impose paternalistic visions on other parts of the world that are going to go on to have an effect, of course, beyond just the colonial period. Even after decolonization, these theories of development and European and Western and American ability to impose medical improvements and medical knowledge on these non-Western global South populations continues to have an informal imperial effect long after decolonization. So to wrap up then everything that we've been talking about, we've been thinking about the ways that disease constrained and shaped where empires could and couldn't expand in the early modern period and up into the 18th and early 19th century. And that we've also been thinking about the ways that disease informed the theory and identity of empire as it evolved. Partly because it cut to the real heart of human difference. It cuts to the heart of what makes some people distinct from others, and how people can adapt to living in different parts of the world, whether they're able to, and whether that's justified by the rules of nature or by the rules of God. And that then helps to in turn frame the construction of ideas about racial difference that become so central to empire, both to slavery and then to 19th century ideas of racial superiority, as we've been seeing, and the dangers of the exotic. And also it helps to frame the capacities of the state, where the state can and can't interject into the lives of ordinary people, be that colonists, European colonists, or be that colonized peoples. So epidemics then, in many respects, get at the real central ethos of colonialism. They also expose the inherent contradictions, though, in these theories. Europeans, for all of the things that they talk about, are unable to really address and prevent large numbers of deaths until you get to the late 19th century. And so all of this is so much framing of things that really Europeans are still struggling to grasp themselves. And so there are inherent contradictions then in their belief that maybe they are superior, but then maybe they also, why is it then that they are not able to achieve these things in certain places? Why, if the state's capacity, if the empire's capacity is this strong in certain places, why is it not able to do these things? And so this really kind of constantly raises existential questions about the legitimacy of European empires and requires them to constantly be in negotiation with improved scientific knowledge to recreate the rationales of empire at different moments. And so, in some respects, then, it's worth thinking about, as we conclude this, the ways in which disease defines and tests the claims of any global effort to assert authority, the ways in which any geopolitical claim to authority over space, both within a modern nation state or beyond it, in formal and informal ways, the ways that diseases challenge but also help to define the limits of that power. Now, as I said at the beginning of this, I don't mean to imply that power is solely lays with epidemic disease and with medicine. There are all sorts of other factors that play in here, but a part of our role as historians is to figure out to what extent disease and health helps to shape what part it plays and where it's most influential, where it's less influential in this overall story of European imperialism. Hopefully what I've done is provided you with an overarching superstructure in which you can explore, if you're interested, individual parts of this story and think more in detail about the ways that disease and health helps to frame empire and racial difference in different moments throughout this long story of European imperialism. I'll be available to answer any questions. I'll be happy to respond to any emails or to respond through Canvas. And so if you have any questions, please do let me know. Thank you.